We all agree that probably the most offensive part at yesterday's meeting. Well, there were two, and one of them relates to Peggy Hubbard,
Yeah.
and I'll let you share that very briefly. But for starters, there were two, I think, offensive moments, and they could go either or. I think they're interchangeable. But one of them was when Vince Colber, who is a senior leader in the Illinois GOP, the finance committee chairman, he was in charge of all the fundraising this year, and it was talking about how we raised $2.2 million. We haven't raised this much in a very long time. And that seems 2.2 million. Okay, that could seem a little bit impressive considering the money that we couldn't raise in past elections. But when you compare that to Pritzker, 152 million that he spent on Democrat races, including his own, 152 million versus 2.2 million.
Yes.
I mean, it's
almost a rounding error at that point.
It's a rounding error. But while giving his finance update, Mr. Colber looked around the room. He's a multimillionaire, very successful businessman. Looked around the room at the 200 grassroots activists assembled. Again, many of them had driven hours, 5-6 hours, hundreds of miles for their voices to be heard. There were single moms and single dads. There were activists that could only give their time and treasure.
And they do.
And they do. And they work their fingers to the bone, as Tom DeVore said. And that is 100% true. But Mr. Colber looked around the room and he said, I assume all of you have donated to the Illinois GOP. And the room shouted back and said, no, no. And then Mr. Colber replied, no. Then what are you doing here? Shocking. And you could see the shock in the room of people kind of looking around and saying, did he just say what I thought he did? And it was just incredibly offensive. That was point number one. Scott, share offensive moment number two.
Yeah, well, Mark, you had mentioned that they limited public comment to 90 seconds each, which is just enough time to say about nothing, really. It's a very short window of time. And for some of those people who have traveled so far to have their voice, to express their concerns to the Central Committee, to be heard, 90 seconds is not fair enough. Peggy Hubbard drove 390 miles, something like that, to be there, driving hours in her truck. It broke down at one point on the way. And she had prepared a speech, and they said, well, you get 90 seconds. So there were 10 people who had offered up their 90 seconds so that she would have a couple minutes, right? She'd have a little bit more time to present her speech, and she had written it out. And at the 90-second mark, they cut her off, and she said, no, I got, these 10 people over here have given me more time. And they said, no sharing of time. You're done. And she said, look, I drove 300 and whatever miles it is to be here. I drove several hours to be here. I'm going to say my speech. And they ripped the mic out of her hand.
Ripped the mic out of her hand. And later,
and let's think about that. That's Peggy Hubbard. It's someone they don't want to hear from. It's a black woman with a large following and a voice, and they don't want to hear that at all. But later, when one of their own wanted extra time, they let him speak. He said, I'm a candidate and I worked really hard, so I get extra time. And they let him keep speaking.
Shocking.